Welcome back. This is your final micro lecture for your chapter on East Asia. And for this micro lecture, we are going to explore human rights issues, and we'll look momentarily at gender inequality associated with China, the Little Emperor's syndrome. All right, let's talk about it. So when it comes to human rights issues in the world, North Korea is probably one of the worst countries associated with human rights violations. And as it relates to this region, they are definitely the worst as it relates to human rights violations. So countries that are flagged for human rights violations are those countries who have repeatedly been criticized for human rights abuses. Think restriction of speech, censorship, imprisonment of political opponents, persecution of minorities. Those are going to be countries that are criticized for human rights abuses. Recently, in 2025, the United States has actually been added to a watch list for human rights abuses. So let's go ahead though and explore North Korea and China as they relate to these human rights abuses in this region of East Asia. So North Korea is probably best known for their authoritarian rule, meaning it's essentially a dictatorship. North Korea is one of the most repressive regimes in the world. They have widespread reports of political repression, forced labor camps, as well as a lack of freedom of expression. They are heavily censored, so much so that the government controls all media, restricts movement, and suppresses any form of dissent. If you watch K-drama, oftentimes you'll see a defector, like someone who came over the DMZ line. They crossed the 38th parallel, and we talked about the 38th parallel with the Korean War. They cross the 38th parallel, and then they meet a woman or a man on the South Korean side. They fall in love, and there's like conflict about how they're going to get back home or if they're going to go back home. That's North Korea. Again, the influence of K-drama on the lives of the world. International influence. All right, let's talk about China's human rights issues. So China's bad for violating human rights, but understand that North Korea, as it relates to this region, they are going to be worse. The People's Republic of China. So both North Korea and China are communists. Whereas North Korea is definitely still economically communist, China is very much so capitalist as it relates to the economy, and the government is going to be capitalist as it relates to the economy, and the government is going to be very communist. I hope I said that right. The People's Republic of China, the government of China, says that people should focus on positive rights associated with human rights. So they should focus on food. They should focus on shelter. They should focus on clothing. They should not focus on quote unquote negative rights like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. So positive rights demand a more active role by the state, and negative rights suggest non-interference by the state. China at one point had the most executions of any country. The Chinese government has been criticized for repressing political dissent. They've been criticized for controlling media and censoring the internet. They're also flagged for the treatment of their ethnic minorities. They've been accused of human rights violations, in particular against the Uyghur Muslims. The Uyghurs are, historically, they are like Central Asian nomads, and those people, the Uyghurs, Uighurs, Uyghurs, have been subjected to mass detention, forced labor, as well as cultural assimilation efforts. And we cannot forget the treatment of the Tibetan people. So the Chinese government has been criticized for its treatment of Tibetans, including restrictions on religious practices as well as cultural suppression. And last but not least for this chapter, this on East Asia, we'll look at little man's syndrome. So little man's syndrome refers to a phenomenon in China where single children, typically children from only child families, these children are typically male. I should put that on your slide. So these male children they have a sense of entitlement, largely because they are the only children in their families. They are excessively spoiled by parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, because oftentimes they may be the only child. This condition, known as Little Emperor Syndrome, gains attention in the 1990s and early 2000s, and it's a reflection, or it's a result of China's one-child policy of the 1979 through 2015 era. So you have this generation of children with no siblings, and they get all the attention, all the affection, all the resources from the adults in their lives, and they are excessively entitled and spoiled. Because they are the only children and the center of their parents' and grandparents' universes, there's oftentimes very high expectations for them. They're the only kid, so high expectations to excel academically. The problem with China's one-child policy and the fact that they were kind of practicing female infanticide, which is the act of killing girl babies in the 1980s and 1990s, the fact that that is happening, it's also going to create a excessive number of males in the society. And as a result of this excessive number of males, you're going to have men who aren't going to be able to find wives because they killed the girl babies as a result of female infanticide, because boys were the valued child. Because boys in China are not seen as a liability. Girls were seen as a liability culturally. And that's because the girl, if she didn't marry well, she'd be like a burden on her family. So the male child was expected to be the child who was going to take care of the parents in their old age. Yes. He's seen as an asset, whereas girls were seen as a liability. So those male children are valued, and all of this Little Emperor Syndrome is a reflection of a one-child policy that China had in the 80s through 2015. And it definitely distorts gender equality even more so. Yeah, we know that the males are seen as culturally more valued than females. Now, after 2015, that one-child policy was officially relaxed. So after 2015, families were allowed to have 2 children, and more recently, 3-child policies were introduced in response to the fact that China had an aging population and declining birth rates, which means the population wasn't growing. All right. Cool. That's all I have for this chapter on East Asia. I will see you soon again for another micro lecture on another part of the world. Goodbye.